Hi everyone, and welcome to part 5 video of our first week tutorial on 3D modeling. My name's David, and we're about to get started. We're going to learn a lot about Edit Poly over our course, and so we're going to get started today by not only learning more about Edit Poly, we're also going to be learning about different modifiers and different types of objects we can create inside 3D Studio Max in our command panel on the right hand side here. So I've got you guys playing around a little bit in the standard primitives, creating boxes, cones, spheres. Try and play around with creating more objects if you haven't already in this first menu. There's even things like Text Plus that allows us to create text inside 3D Studio Max, which is something we didn't really take a look at too much, but it works like creating any other object inside 3D Studio Max. We can left click and drag anywhere to create a text box in 3D. And then we can start typing in our text. So we can type Academy, let's type OADT. And now we have this. And we can change the parameters of this. If we were to right click and get out of this mode, you'll notice that if we click on this object again, we don't have access to the parameters. That's because they're in the Modify panel now. Like we were playing around with our simple objects, including boxes and whatever else you created before, once you go into the Modify panel, whatever that object type is that we created, in the Modify panel, there will be a modifier there already for that type of object. And for this one, it's Text Plus, in which we can modify the length of the box, the width of the box. We can modify the font, change the font type to whatever we'd like, Arial, black, regular. We can make it bold, italic, underline it. We can change a whole bunch of different things, including the size of the text, the tracking of the text, the leading, horizontal scale, vertical scale. We can extrude it outwards as much as we want. We can extrude it in different segments. So if I zoom in closer here, and then I put on edge faces, you'll see if I add extruded segments, it gives us more segments to play with if we're going to modify that mesh in any way. And we can apply a bevel to give it a little bit more shape to it. And there's automatically details such as engrave, half circle to give our text a little bit of flair. You can see how cool that looks when we add different modifiers to it. So if you're planning to modify any text in 3D or trying to do a logo or work for other people, try and use Text Plus because there are lots of different options to make text look really, really good and add a whole bunch of substance to it without doing too much work, including being able to change bevel push, outline offset, how many steps it'll take, the bevel depth. So lots of little things to play around with. So that's in our simple menu, which is in our standard primitives. We have box, cone, geosphere, spheres. We've played around with a little bit of these, and Text Plus is kind of an added option inside the newest versions of 3 Studio Max. But we can also click on standard primitives, and we can open up this menu to even more options. You can see, since we're in the Create Geometry panel, there's lots of different geometry that we can create inside 3D Studio Max. This menu also contains particle systems, patch grids, and you can see a few different options that are actually pretty handy for creating environments at a more faster pace. Excuse me. That includes doors and windows and stairs. Now, if you look through those menus, you'll actually be able to create things like doors, stairs, and windows rather fast. So play around with those and try and figure out what you like best here. So for instance, if you're following by my example, I'm going to create a sliding door. And this one, I'm going to left click and drag, and it creates the base of my door. If I let go of left click, I'm now creating the width of my door. And if I left click again, now I'm going to create the height of my door. And you'll notice that I have a set of doors already created for me that will be nice sliding doors for any type of household situation. We can also flip, given the parameters underneath here. Remember, if we right click to get out of the creation mode, we can go to our modify panel to access those parameters again. And we can change the width, the depth, the door offset. We can change how open the doors are too. So if we were doing animation, that would be great. And if we turned on auto keyframe, it would actually animate itself. However, if you're just doing a rendering and then the door needs to be halfway open or all the way closed, this is an easy way to control that. You can also change the thickness, the railings, if there's any railings, the inside of the doors, how many panels there are, if you want more panels. You can see that this is a great way to get panels in. I'm going to turn edge faces on. and maximize my viewport so you get a better view of this. Don't forget you can also go to hidden line mode, which is kind of nice to see a gray outline of the model and the white outlines and the white edges. It makes it a little bit easier to see sometimes. So creating other objects inside 3D Studio Max is actually quite simple, and just by going through the Create menu and going through Geometry, and then changing the sub menu here from Standard Primitives to something else, such as we were just in Doors right there, but we can change it to something like Extended Primitives. Now, just like Standard Primitives, Extended Primitives are simple objects that 3D Studio Max will generate for you that you can change some parameters to adjust. I'm going to create an oil tank here as an example. I left click and drag to create the base. I let go of that so I can create the height. I left click again, and now it lets me modify the curve, creating a type of capsule type shape. There actually is a capsule option as well that works just a little bit different than the oil tank, because it kind of gives it this shape automatically. There's also spindle shapes, a little bit more complex, left click drag, and then we can actually, third option is create like a top like shape right there. So don't be afraid to play around with standard primitives and extended primitives to create new shapes to work from. The better the base shape that matches exactly what you're trying to do, and then going into Edit Poly, the easier it will be for you to work with and to modify different objects. That includes anything inside this menu. Things like stairs, doors, windows, standard, extended primitives. Um, I would just suggest for now to play around in standard and extended primitives and use them as a base before you add edit poly. So just try and get something that matches your shape close, and then we can play around with different object modes. So the one thing I'd like you guys to do is remember when we were building your box character, we actually had arms developed. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start building out a chest out of just a regular box. And this is called the box modeling technique. Most modelers start using this technique because it uses one simple object, and we're going to use some tools that allow us to make it a little bit easier for us to mirror objects from one side to another. And I'm going to teach you how to mirror objects so that we're able to modify multiple objects at once. I'm going to take this box here, I'm going to add a few segments to it, like this. And I'm going to create a chest out of this. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to our Modify panel, I'm going to add Edit Poly. So my box is 2, 2, 2 in the segments. I'm going to add Edit Poly modifier. I'm going to play around with the vertexes a bit. I'm just going to create a nice puffed out torso. Something just simple that'll work for us. Like that. And then I'm going to bring this in just a little bit. I'll change this to like a gray color so it doesn't hurt our eyes as much. There you go, just like blue. And I'm going to move these vertexes a bit as well. And I'm going to bring these vertices back. Just do a little bit of adjustments until you get kind of a shape you're happy with. I'm going to scale these in just like that. Scale those in. I'm going to pop this chest out just a little bit more. This is just a really simple object that I'm working with. The next step I'm going to do is I'm going to make a cylinder. And the reason why I'm going to make a cylinder is I'm going to make kind of a spaghetti type arm. So I'm going to use an additional tool called, well, you'll see it in about just 1 second. I want you to grab your shape. I want you to add the Edit Poly modifier. I want you to add Edit Poly modifier and then go to Vertex. And we're going to use a tool called Soft Selection. Now you'll notice as we were creating objects, I'm going to back up here just 1 second. I'm going to add a cap. Remember to try and always add a cap segment until you get lines on it, visible edges, because if there's not, you'll create a bad high polygon mesh that won't work for a lot of situations. So try and create the cap segments there. Go to Edit Poly mode, go to Vertex mode, and you'll notice we can click a vertex, and we can move a single vertex around. So I can create a point like this inside, I can move this around how I see fit. However, if I really needed to adjust this arm a little bit more organically, it's going to be hard. I'm going to grab the top part of this arm, all the vertexes at the very top, and I'm just going to adjust it so that it kind of fits in here. And then I can keep adjusting these, bit by bit. However, let's say I can't access some of the vertexes, or I want to organically move something along. Using a tool called Soft Selection will make that possible. So I'm going to click on the Soft Selection toolbar. I'm in Vertex mode. I look down my parameters, and I find Soft Selection. I open that up, and I see a little key that says Use Soft Selection. just click that on. You're probably going to notice that even if you have a single vertex selected, you're going to see a variety of colors appear around that object now. Around that vertex, I should say, sorry. Soft selection is also available in edge and polygon mode, so you'll be using this tool probably quite often if you're working a lot with organic shapes. So if we turn soft selection on, what it's doing is allowing us to select the one vertex, which is now completely red, which means that it has the most power, power of 1, which means that 100% of that vertex will move when I move this cursor. Now the color fades away from orange, yellow, green, and blue to tell us like less power is being used constantly by those vertexes. So it normally goes all the way from red all the way down to blue. And then what that's telling you is that's how much power it is. We can actually change the fall off for how far that goes. So you can either type in a number or you can left click and drag on these arrows to change the amount of fall off or percentage of vertexes or polygons or edges that it will take from the one you have selected. So if we change this number and then I move this vertex, you're going to see what happens. Everything moves with it accordingly, kind of stretches accordingly right there. So if I were to grab this entire row of vertexes, you're going to see that there's a little bit of power given towards everything else as well. So everything's moving a little bit more fluidly. And if I add more power, you're going to see even the bottom part of the arm stretches with it. So let's say, for some reason or another, that I am very, very content with this. I can move, I can rotate, I can scale, and I have a good pair of sleeves that I like. Just like that. Now, what we did before is we just copied an arm over. I can hold shift and copy this arm over, but I'm not going to get the exact arm I want, the exact same position I want. Even if I were to rotate this, it wouldn't fit like the other arm does. It's not all scaled exactly the same. It's going to be a bit awkward. I'm going to use a tool called the mirror tool, which will create a reflection of what I've created here, and I can put it right in place that I want. So I'm going to go to Tools. I'm going to go to Mirror. So at the very top of 3ds Studio Max in the toolbar, with your object selected, select the object you want to mirror, go to Tools, and go to Mirror. It's going to work almost like the copy panel, except it allows us to have a few different tools. Mirror access tells us what axis do you want to mirror it on. If you look at your green, blue, and red lines, we see red is X, and then we have Z or Z, which is blue, which is up and down, and we have Y, which is forward and back, which X being left and right. So we want to mirror it left and right, so we keep X on. We're happy with that. We can also change it just by clicking any of these if we're happier with a different direction, but X will work fine for us. But now you notice that the arm we originally had is completely gone. That's because it's on no clone mode, which means it's not copying over. If we tell it to be a copy, it will leave the old arm the way it is and create this copy for us that we can move into position that we want, which is great. Now, a copy is great, but if we were to modify this arm more, we'd have to delete this arm here and change it and then have to copy and paste it all over again, and that's going to be a lot of work. If you're working on an object, like an arm here, and you're going to copy it, if you're still working on it and will modify that mesh still, I would suggest to copy it as a reference or an instance. An instance is a single object that will reflect what the first object is, and the reference is the same thing, except we can actually have multiple of these. I'm going to create a reference. I'm going to click OK, and you're going to notice, once I put it into place here, so I think this is, yeah, that's a pretty correct position right there. I can go to my first or original object or my new object, and I can go to Edit Poly Vertex, and you'll notice that now, if I change the vertexes on one object, it will change for the other object as well. You'll notice that because this object is selected, which is my reference, my new reference object, there's actually a white line in the modifier list. That's because 3D Studio Max is letting you know with that white line that this is actually referencing a different object. If I go to my original object, see, the white line is no longer there. But if I go to my new object, that white line is there. So just be aware that if there's a white line, that means that object is referencing another object. To make it no longer reference another object, we just need to right-click on this object and click Collapse To, or Make Unique. Collapse To or Make Unique. Make Unique will separate it from the original object, and you'll notice now that white line is gone. If for some reason make unique is not available, click collapse to and it will break that modifier down. And now we have two unique objects that we like that work as our sleeves for our 3D model. This works when it comes to 3D modeling a character as well. So for instance, let's say I was 3D modeling a chest. Now it took me a bit of time to make sure both sides were correct, and I had to go to vertexes here, and I always had to select the same vertex on the opposite side to keep it symmetrical. But if you're working on a symmetrical object, there's no point in having to always select the left side, then the right side, and doing something and changing it constantly. What we can do is make a mirror reference and then work from that. So to do that, I'm actually going to delete half my chest model. And now I'm left with an open hole and only half a chest. Now I'm going to go to Tools, and I'm going to go to Mirror, and it's going to create Transform Mirror on the X, which is left and right, and it's going to create a reference. Luckily enough, our pivot point was right in the middle of our object, and it referenced exactly symmetrically for us to use. So now if I modify one part of the object, I just have to grab the vertexes or polygons or edges on the left side, and it will automatically do the same thing on the right side. Once you're done modifying the object to how you like, you can then, after I'm done modifying just a tiny bit, like so, you can then go to the second part of the object. I'm going to right click, make this unique, and while it's on edit poly mode, I can actually scroll down my menu, and in edit geometry, I'm going to go to attach and attach them back together again, just like that. Now this is where we're going to learn about one special tool in vertex mode. So we've learned to hold vertexes and move vertexes around pretty easily. We learned to attach objects, great. And we learned about soft selection. But because I put two objects together and they need to be organically welded together, we need to start a welding process. You'll notice that I put these two objects together, but they're still separate elements. If you go to element mode, and these two objects should be together, but they're not. The vertexes in the middle haven't been welded together yet. We need to do that. To do that, you go to Edit Poly Vertex mode, and you go to Weld. But you don't go to Weld itself. There's a little box beside Weld, and if you hover above it, it says Settings. This allows us to alter the settings of the Weld tool to make sure that we are welding correctly. I grab the two vertexes, or even more vertexes that I want, like so. These three rows up top here. And you'll notice that there's no preview of it welding. This will allow this tool, Weld Vertices, allows us to preview what's going to weld. And currently at 0.1, nothing is going to weld. It says before there are 34 vertices, and afterwards there's 34 vertices, which means nothing is welding. If I increase that number, you're going to notice that it previews exactly what happened to our model. Before, there's 34 vertices, and afterwards there'll be 31 if you push apply and continue, or if you push OK. You can cancel out right now, and it won't weld. However, if we go back to weld options, it will say, okay, well, before 34, after 31, with these vertexes selected. If I only had these two end vertexes selected, it would say before 34, after 33. So I can click apply and continue, and I can select the next row, and select the next row. And when I'm done, I can just click the check mark right here. But for right now, I need to select all these vertexes all around our 3D model and click apply and continue. Now, if you want to make it a little simpler for yourself, what I normally like to do is go to the top view and select everything down the middle of my model and then click apply and continue, then click OK. Normally that's enough to get everything welded. However, if there was a lot of detail all around these vertexes, they'd be really hard to catch and chances are you might weld something wrong. But as long as your model is really simple, don't forget you can always go in the top view and go right down the middle and just weld everything. So the one thing you probably noticed is when I mirrored the arm was in a weird location and I actually had to move the arm. But luckily the chest happened to be right down the middle and it mirrored perfectly on the other side. That's because of what's called the pivot point of a 3D object. So I will create a box and demonstrate to you the pivot point of a 3D object and how to modify that. I'm going to create this box here. And you're going to notice that the pivot point, or where my object focus is, where the blue, red, and green arrows are coming from, is right down at the bottom middle of this box. It's not at the center, it's actually at the bottom middle. 3D Studio Max automatically generates where it thinks the pivot point of your model should be. However, what you're going to notice, especially when you add an edit poly modifier and begin playing around with your model, is that the pivot point might not actually add up to your model at all. Let's say I move all these vertexes, start doing some changes here, just going a bit crazy like that. And I'm going to go back to my normal object selection mode. Look what happens. Our pivot point is actually way off our model. If I was going to use the tools mirror, it uses this as the mirror, and it would pop all the way on the other side of our 3D model. What we need to do is change where the pivot point is on our 3D model. So we have to go to a new menu. We were talking about the create panel to create objects. We were modifying our objects in the modify panel. And now we need to go to the hierarchy panel. The hierarchy panel only has a few limited options that we really need to play around with. And those are at the very top in the adjust pivot menu. This menu right here. You can see that we actually have our pivot point here. We can move and rotate and scale on this pivot point, and everything rotates around that pivot point. But we need to modify it maybe to the center of our object. So we click on what's called Affect Pivot Only. Affect Pivot Only brings up new arrows around our pivot point that we're able to alter by itself. This will not affect your object in any way. Right now with Affect Pivot Only, it only affects the pivot point of your object. So we can match it up however we want. So if you want your pivot point to match up to a different location on your 3D model, just look through the different viewports and try and find out exactly where you want that pivot point to be. If I was going to mirror something, I'd probably want it right on the edge that I'm going to mirror, which would be right here, let's say. Or if I don't need to mirror this, or I want my pivot point somewhere else, I'd probably want it in the center of the object. Now that might be hard to do, to picture where the center of the object is. And you're like, okay, well maybe this is it, moving it yourself and adjusting it. However, the alignment tool, which is still in our hierarchy menu in the adjust pivot panel, allows us to adjust the pivot point to wherever it seems fit automatically. That is center to object, align to object, or align to world, or reset the pivot completely. If I reset the pivot completely, it goes back to the standard position. I don't really want that, so I'm going to go to center to object, and it centers right to the middle of my object. Now I can push it and pull it wherever I want to. That's up to you to decide if you need to mirror something or if you'd like a pivot point in a different location. However, there are good uses for a pivot point that you want to be aware of. So for instance, if I'm making a treasure chest, if I make a box, and I'm going to make the top part of that box, just like this, just very simply to demonstrate. And let's say I wanted to open the treasure chest. Now, in games, you don't really add new bones to this type of simple object. That would take a lot of time and too much for something as simple as a box opening. But if I were to rotate the top part of this model, what would happen is it would intersect with my model. That's because the pivot point is right in the middle of this 3D object that I've created. If I change the position of this pivot point, however, to exactly where the pivot point of a chest top would be, so moving it all the way back, say about here, oh, wrong location, sorry, the back of the 3D model, which is about there. I look at my left view, sorry, apologies, I looked in the wrong view. I move it to the back of the 3D model, where I think it'll rotate. It should rotate as being a treasure chest top. I then use the rotate tool, and now we get a proper chest opening and closing. This is an easy way to create simple animations or simple objects inside 3D Studio Max that can be used and animated properly without having to do any rigging at all. By adjusting the pivot points in the right location, you're able to move and manipulate objects much easier rate. So don't forget, that's in the third panel at the very top. That's our adjust pivot panel, and we can affect pivot only. When the big arrows are on, that means affect pivot only is on. You can always turn them off just by clicking that. And remember, anything inside 3D Studio Max that blue means it's active. Anything that's gray means it's inactive at the moment. So don't forget to try and play around with not only standard primitives, but extended primitives and different things like doors and windows and stairs. We'll touch upon other objects later, but I think those will be fine for now. And don't forget to go into your modify panel, add edit poly, play around, and then go to your hierarchy and change the pivot points of where things are located, and you'll have an easier time animating objects and moving them around in your scenes. Thank you very much for watching. That was part 5 on how to edit and manipulate objects. Next, we're going to be talking about expanding on those tool sets. Can't wait to hear from you next time. See you later.